Dusty here with a brief conversation about anthropological theory. I have received multiple emails and some questions during office hours from students this week asking for more clarity about theory. More specifically, what is it and why is it important in anthropology? Now, I should state before I get started that most four-year universities offer multiple undergraduate courses and graduate seminars specifically focused on anthropological theory. As such, I doubt if this brief video is going to answer everyone's question, but hopefully it does provide a little bit more clarity on the subject. So first, what is theory in anthropology? And I think that the simple answer is theory is a tool that anthropologists use to help them organize their data, look for patterns, and interpret complex human cultural behavior. That's the real utility of anthropological theory. Now, most anthropologists go in the field and collect data by engaging in ethnographic fieldwork, usually involving participant observation and informant interviews. So if you spend, say, 6 or 8 months in the field, you come back with multiple data sets. And theory is then used as a filter or a processing tool to help make sense of those data. Otherwise, it would be a daunting task. So to provide an example of how this works, I'll use the example that's already posted on Canvas, and that's the Riddle of the Sacred Cow by Marvin Harris. Marvin Harris is a very prominent American anthropologist who was working amongst Hindu communities in India. And he found out very early on that most Hindu people don't eat beef. And when he asked his informants about that taboo, the response was generally, we don't eat beef because cows are sacred. That is what we call the Emic perspective. That's the insider's perspective of a cultural phenomenon. But Marvin Harris was a firm supporter of cultural materialism. And that's a theoretical paradigm that relies heavily on science, the scientific method, the collection of empirical data that can then be quantified and analyzed statistically. So Marvin Harris wasn't happy with the answer, cows are sacred. So he did some background research, and he found out that about 3,000 years ago, a lot of Hindu people did eat cows. However, in the past 3,000 years, the ecological context of India changed dramatically. It became more arid, and the population grew exponentially. He also knew that cows, to be a cattle rancher, you need a lot of land, a lot of water, and a lot of food. And the ecological contexts were limiting all three of those things. So Marvin Harris came up with a different interpretation about the taboo against eating beef using the outsider's perspective, the etic perspective, and by filtering his data and using cultural materialism to interpret those data. And what Marvin Harris suggested in The Riddle of the Sacred Cow is that cows are no longer consumed because it doesn't make economic or ecological sense to raise cows for food in India. It makes a lot more sense to use them as vehicles to pull plows, to grow crops than eat, and then also use the dairy products for food themselves. So that's one example. So theory is a tool, but it's also much more than that. The theoretical paradigm that individual anthropologists subscribes to also impacts the types of questions the research questions they ask, and also how they interact with their informants in the field. Cultural materialists, for example, usually want to collect quantifiable data, numbers, statistics. For example, if I was an anthropologist working amongst a group of fishermen or fisher folk in Polynesia, I might record how many fish they catch, the caloric value of those fish, how they're divided amongst the community, so forth and so on. A person subscribing to postmodernism, and postmodernism is the theoretical paradigm that critiqued cultural materialism for being overly scientific. They might ask, instead of how many fish you catch, why do you fish in the first place? And they collect data in the form of narrative and story and personal opinion. For example, a person subscribing to postmodernism might ask a person who fishes, how does fishing influence their personal identity or their cultural identity within the group? And cultural identity is one of those phenomena that can't necessarily be quantified. You can't associate a number with it. I can count the amount of calories that a tuna fish has in it, but how do you count and analyze somebody's personal identity? A person subscribing to feminist theory might go and work with the same group of fisher folk in Polynesia and try to analyze how fishing is related to gender inequality within a specific group. So right there we have how cultural materialism, postmodernism, and feminists or feminist theorists might approach working with a group of fisher folk very differently, based primarily on how what theoretical paradigm they subscribe to. Now, it used to be in the dark past of anthropology that anthropologists, even at the graduate student level, would have to pick a theory and subscribe to it and defend that theory with their research and use that theory. But now we are living in a very productive era that's multi-theoretical. So if you were interested in studying fishing in Polynesia, you might use cultural materialism to look at the environmental impacts of human fishing on reef systems, but you also might use postmodernism to understand how the decline of fishing due to global warming is impacting personal cultural beliefs and cultural identity. And then you might use feminist theory to try to interpret how fishing influences gender hierarchy and sexual division of labor within that community. Anyway, if you have any more questions, and I hope you do, I hope you have more questions about theory, please reach out to me ASAP. I love having conversations about theory, so please drop me a line and we can have a chat. Cheers.